Welcome back to another episode of Tuba People TV, where we talk about all things Arnold Jacobs all the time. Puddles and I are in Overland Park, Kansas, here at the home of Frank Byrne, who is the Executive Director of the Kansas City Symphony, and for 27 years, a member of the United States Marine Band in Washington, D.C., and for many of those 27 years, a member of the tuba section of that band. Thanks for joining us, Frank.
My pleasure.
Frank is also, he was a student of Arnold Jacobs and is responsible for these two discs. He produced these discs, and if you're not familiar with these discs, I highly recommend them. Legacy of an Artist and Portrait of an Artist. They're available at the usual outlets.
Yeah.
But thank you for your efforts with these projects.
Absolutely. I was delighted and honored to do it, to in a small way repay my great debt to Mr. Jacobs for all that he did for me, and to try to perpetuate the great legacy of his teaching and his artistry for people that didn't have the pleasure of studying with him as you and I did.
Well, it's a great collection of his, little snippets of his philosophy and playing solo in his basement and in the orchestra. So it's
well, the goal was to make each CD a complete unit in and of itself. So if you happen to get one or the other in the beginning, that there was enough basic information about his philosophies of breathing and of musicianship in each one of them that they would be complete. But if you had both, they would complement one another in different ways. And I only wish there had been more material to work with, but it was quite a interesting and involved project, but I'm delighted the way it came out.
Yeah, well, me too. They're excellent. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Do you let's talk about your studies with Jake. What was your first encounter with Mr. Jacobs, and when did you start studying with him?
In 1974, and it was after I came into the Marine Band in December of 1973, and prior to that time had lived in Hawaii, so there was really no hope for me to get to Chicago.
Couldn't drive.
No, I couldn't, and couldn't swim either. That wouldn't have helped. But in the spring of 1974, the Chicago Symphony came to the Kennedy Center, as they used to do on an annual basis. And I went to the concert, and the program, which I still remember, was the Berlioz Franck Juge Overture, the Schubert Third Symphony, and then the Enigma Variations. Well, at intermission, I went up to the front of the stage and asked one of the members of the orchestra if they could go get Arnold Jacobs. And he came out to the front of the stage, and I introduced myself, and I'm sure I was falling all over myself, and told him how I'd like to come study with him. And as usual, he told me to call him and we'd see what we would work out. And after a number of the requisite phone calls, I was able to make my first trip to Chicago in 1974.
Do you remember that lesson?
I absolutely do. And it was a defining moment in my life in many respects, not just musically, because in so many ways, he was a remarkable mentor and teacher about things beyond playing the tuba. And I really had no idea when I walked into that studio in the Fine Arts Building what I was getting myself into, or what impeccable musical standards he had. So I went in there with some perception of my playing and some idea of where I fit in the scheme of things compared to him. And in telling people about this, I say, imagine if you had a 12-inch ruler and someone told you early in your life and you grew up believing that that was a yardstick, and that became your idea of what constituted that unit of measurement. Well, when I went to Arnold Jacobs, he kind of turned my world upside down, and I walked out of there with no higher estimation of my own abilities, probably lower, but my estimation of his abilities was just off the charts, because I came to realize that his standards were far, far beyond anything that I was aware of. He was listening for things, knew things, heard things, performed things, and reproduced things in his playing that were down to the incredible level of detail that I just couldn't comprehend. And, putting myself on the track of trying to emulate him, and he would say things like, I want you to compete with me. Make that your standard. Just really changed my whole concept of thinking about playing, and was transformational. So in that first lesson, I was taken back to some very simple material, and he pointed out to me how I was not using nearly enough air, not taking in enough air, not using enough air, and he got me, assigned me to play on the mouthpiece 30 minutes a day, something that became quite a ritual in my life. And in what little bit of playing I do right now, I still try to play on the mouthpiece and using him as my inspiration.
Mm. So it was just learning to buzz better, more efficiently. Did he have you buzzing drill forms, or did he have you buzzing melodies?
Melodies exclusively, and he would play things like Pop Goes the Weasel or My Country 'Tis of Thee or something like that, simple melodies. But the key was, or even Happy Birthday, the key was that you play things on the mouthpiece that you know intimately, and you have a very strong mental concept of the tune and which note is coming next. Nothing you have to think about, but where there's a strong recall. And so I began just going down that path. And as I told you earlier, I would, over the years, do all kinds of things and, play Christmas carols year-round. Anything that I knew very, very well, and gradually would do things like play along with the radio. I would find it helpful to not know what's coming up next on the radio, but it's a song you're familiar with and you can play along with it, or play along with a recording of a favorite classical piece or something else, or recording of Sousa marches or whatever it might be. Anything that would just keep the sound going and give you something to emulate.
Was there, was he explicit in his instructions for you in terms of using the melodies, or is that something that you picked up on?
No, he was very explicit about that, and I think he realized that in some respects, while I was an okay player, I think he realized how the fact that I honestly had not had great teaching to that point, and the people that had taught me, some were not even tuba players, and may have helped musically, but did not help at all in terms of the mechanics that would make one a better player and improve your sound production and those things like that. So of course he measured my vital capacity, and then, once having determined that I was physically healthy, the problem that drove me to see him with such urgency was that I had developed a double buzz in my playing. And he determined, that it was a result of restricted airflow. And I know I have a fairly large tongue, and it was getting in the way. And my concept of sound and vowels was not keeping my airway open. And the free exchange of air in and out without friction, and no resistance until you're at the lips and things like that were very helpful in beginning to change it. But just hearing him play, hearing his sound, and sort of getting a sense of how he operated, because he was a magnificent singer. Mm-hmm. And when he often talked about singing and using singing with playing, I think that he had a distinct advantage that if you cannot sing or do not sing and have not, that's not a part of your life, I think it's a bit more challenging to adapt that and understand that stimulus of the idea of singing. He was a marvelous singer, and one thing that I noticed when he would sing in a lesson or demonstrate something is that it was not a sound that sounded muffled or back in the throat, where it would be lo 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 or something like that. It would be da 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 da, and he would be very robust in his vocalization, and it sounded the same way, of course, when he picked up the horn. Mm-hmm. It was very clear, very articulate, very with a great deal of projection, and just having a different idea about what that should sound like, of course, helped to influence the concept. But honestly, learning to focus on the suction of air without worry where it went, releasing air without becoming locked up, which was a problem of mine and probably something that I will always struggle with. Just the sense of holding your body in a certain position and not relaxing
Yeah.
to allow yourself to collapse fast enough, was certainly a factor. But playing on the mouthpiece and moving large quantities of air was transformational. And if I had to give one piece of advice to someone about how to improve your playing, it would be to dramatically increase the amount of playing you do on the mouthpiece and trying to get a sound on the mouthpiece that closely approximates the sound of the instrument. Because, as you know, that's possible to get a very resonant, nice sound on the mouthpiece, and it can sound almost like the tuba.
Yeah.
And Jake even said, sometimes, imagine that if you got to a gig and you opened your case and the horn wasn't there and you could play it on the mouthpiece to a microphone and no one would even know the difference. So, using the concept that the horn is just a large megaphone that amplifies what you're sending in, if it's not happening here, it's certainly not going to happen on the instrument.
And so you came back for several years.
Quite a few years, yes. I would get to Chicago as often as I could, either by driving or taking the train, and would try to come, 2 to 4 times a year, as often as I could afford it, which I did for many, many years. My work in the Marine Band was really always primarily administrative, and I tried to live this double life of practicing 3 and 4 hours a day on top of my job in the music library and later other administrative jobs. But going to see him was always a rejuvenating, inspiring experience that enabled me to go back home, and in my unique situation where I was not playing full time, to find ways to motivate myself to keep practicing and keep improving. And he was very much in my thoughts almost every day, and still is today. I consider him a major influence in my life, and you've been in my office and you see that right over my desk I have a picture of him, which I have had over my desk for many years now.
Speaking of pictures, you have a picture that I asked you to have.
Oh, I
ready.
do, yeah.
Here's a wonderful picture with you at the Midwest Clinic in
That's
1982,
right.
and
Yeah.
you happened to be in the audience, and he saw you there, and he wanted to demonstrate something, so he nabbed a volunteer.
He did. I mean, there I was, the most eager front row guy you've ever seen, hanging on every word, and I had no idea he would be looking for a victim. But he saw me and pressed me into service and had me demonstrate how to take a full breath and things like that, and then he had me play a couple of notes. Fortunately, not more than a couple.
See, Puddles? I think I was at that clinic too, actually. I was at Midwest in 1982
Yeah.
for that. That's
Yeah.
great. Thank you for bringing that.
Thank you.
So basically, I mean, he had you working on song and wind, essentially.
Yeah.
Song with the buzz and wind with the freer exchange of air. Was there anything else in particular or more specific related to either of those subjects that you recall?
Well, of course, he had some wonderful musical challenges that he would provide, many of which came out of the Arbans book for me. And he would take a very simple exercise and turn it into something that was enormously challenging. Like, I can't tell you which number it is, but there's an exercise where there are slurred half notes, going up about a fifth or so. And, his challenge is to play those with 4 beats of constant dynamic change without any plateaus, where it goes in a perfectly straight line from soft to extremely loud, still with a good tone, and you don't peak until the moment you cut off. And I gotta tell, and then you reverse it. But the idea of doing things like that, and you can remember how he would snap his fingers, and it seems like he was do a lot of things about 60 beats a minute, and I had my metronome set on 60, I think, for years. But things like that, while he would offer a musical challenge, were enormously difficult, I found, to pull off in the manner he wanted them done. And there were so many other things that he would assign through simple material. Matter of fact, in my case, I found it interesting that the longer I studied with him, we did not go to the right in the Arbans book, we went to the left. And we ended up at one point on number one, whole notes. And he said, I started on this in the 1920s and I still use it today.
Mhm.
He said, I would really encourage you to do this 8 beats per note, and and work on your tone quality, and in terms of other things, he would encourage even a scale exercise to be played as if it was a musical etude, and to try to interpret it in some way. And of course, in my case, where what playing I did was, playing in a band, and a very fine band, but you're playing accompaniment parts and things of that nature. He was trying to push me all the time to play solo literature, or something that would, take me out of the mode of being an accompanist and put me more in the mode of becoming a soloist. And that was not something I was especially comfortable doing, but I put myself in the position of doing that. So I worked up a couple of recitals. We had a chamber music series that anybody could sign up and play on, and I did on occasion. Play solo literature, and I played that piece that's on the low brass CD, that Crinus chorale variations,
Yeah.
four trombones and tuba. We played that, and I was playing in some local orchestras at the same time. But the majority of it was trying to expand my horizons about what was possible in my playing by challenging myself through more difficult literature than my normal work would provide.
Well, I remember that he was always encouraging to have more or less have a solo recital. You're always preparing a solo recital, even if you don't have one on the books.
Right.
Just be playing the solo literature, just to keep that musical engagement and etc. That's great.
Well, he was unfailingly encouraging, and I think he may have taken pity on me, because he knew that I was just really trying hard and I was very sincere. And I think that he had a unique way of inspiring people, and so many people have said exactly the same thing that you've interviewed, so my case was certainly not unique. But he was unfailingly kind to me in so many respects, and took particular interest in what my challenges were and my needs. And I think it made a big difference in my confidence in my ability to what I would do next.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. He was very encouraging. That's great to hear. Frank, it seemed to me that whenever Mr. Jacobs played the mouthpiece or played the tuba, there was just this direct connection from his thoughts to his lips. What did you think?
Well, I think that's very true. I sometimes think that the connection between the brain and the lip is a bit like a dimmer switch. And for some of us, it's a kind of a dim light that's coming through the switch. And in his case, I just felt like it was either like a searchlight or a laser or whatever you would want to say, that there was this incredibly strong stimulus that went to that lip that enabled it to vibrate immediately, what he called the instant buzz. And there was simply no delay whatsoever. And I think part of it had to do with the fact that he had such a great ear, and his solfege ability was remarkable.
It was.
And his ability to hear every pitch before he played it, and to zero in and center on it, and then to pick off whatever note he wanted to do, I think was really quite remarkable. And I think his message was so strong that the lip had no choice but to respond and vibrate immediately as he wanted it to. And I would tell you that I think that every problem that I have, or every mistake that I make in my playing, is simply a matter of concentration, and of my failure to have that impeccably clear mental message that is just driving the physical response. Whether you're, but in his case, honestly, I think it was very unique. I mean, he was clearly a natural player in so many ways. As a kid, he taught himself to play the trumpet and later the trombone.
All through imitation, really.
Yes, and he learned to play the Clark Carnival of Venice, practically on his own. And you don't do that unless you have a gift to begin with. But all of that great training that he had in the early days of learning to imitate by listening and imitating, I think served him very well. And everything that he did, certainly when he demonstrated buzzing, or he would stop me and say, you're not buzzing the exact pitches. I want to hear you do that on the mouthpiece. Mm-hmm. And so this idea of going back and forth with the mouthpiece, either just totally out of the horn, or with a device in the horn that allows the air to shunt to the sides, and you can finger the horn if the stimulus of fingering it is good for you, but you have no resistance through the mouthpiece, and you just learn to move more air. And so obviously the issue here is not air pressure, but air movement, the movement of air.
The phenomenon of wind.
Exactly. And he used the incentive spirometers and things like that to take your mind off of what you were doing or some of the other gauges and devices that he had. And the objective was simply control the ball. Mm-hmm. You control the ball, you're obviously controlling your air, but your objective is on something outside of your body.
Product oriented.
Exactly right. And it was so valuable to get this idea of forget about what you're doing physically, just hold the ball at the top, for as long as you can, and you will have taken either a full breath or let out a full breath simply by controlling the ball. And these things became very important. So, a device like the Breath Builder, which, he highly recommended and I think is great as well. You can control the resistance to a bit, but you learn to control this, and I think that using these external devices just distracts you from getting in your own way about worrying about technique and things like that. There are so many things we do in the course of a day that if we had to think about it and do the muscles to make it happen, mm-hmm. I mean, when I get in my car in the morning, I can put the key in the ignition without even looking at it. It's because I've been doing it a lot and I'm familiar with it, but if I thought about it, it would never happen. And the same, I even notice it typing. If I type without thinking about it, my accuracy is much greater than if I stop and start thinking about it, my fingers don't respond as well. Mm-hmm. And of course it's the same with the tuba. He had a lot of natural gifts, which I think he developed to the maximum. But one of the things that we've talked about is what made Arnold Jacobs' sound so unique. And I don't think we know exactly. I think the sound that we've become accustomed to is partially the magnificent instrument that he played on. Such a resonant horn, and you've probably played the horn somewhere along the way.
Yeah.
I played it a little bit mm-hmm. at one of my lessons. It happened to be there. And I will never forget, you practically breathe into the horn, and it makes this incredibly wonderful resonant sound. It was the quickest, easiest responding instrument that I've ever played.
Right.
But also, if we've seen the pictures in the Farkas book, Art of Brass Playing, mm-hmm. the famous picture of his embouchure, and it is a curved embouchure, and
a little S curve.
Yes, it is. And I think actually he had more surface area inside the cup than most of us do with a straight embouchure that we just would go side to side. So there was a bit more vibrating surface that was happening that I think may have contributed to the great resonance that he had in his sound. No way to prove that, but it's just a theory that may have helped to define why he had this incredibly clear and very, very resonant sound, no matter what instrument he played.
Yeah, I think certainly the vocal training that he had, the connection of sound in his mind down the seventh cranial nerve to his lips,
right? All
of that, making sure he had lots of air. I think all those things really, and using the lip surface that he had in the mouthpiece, just using all of it that was there.
Right, and by using he of course buzzed a lot on the mouthpiece and with a rim. Mm-hmm. And by doing that, I think it helped to refine and strengthen what he was doing. But he had such an amazing flexibility. I know that he played with very little pressure, because one time in a lesson, he saw that I had a ring on my lip after playing, and he said, I never get that, no matter how many hours I've been playing or how heavy of a program. So very little pressure on the mouthpiece, and a tremendous amount of air, which provided support for the embouchure, and also, a tremendous amount of vibration. It's a great line in one of the CDs when someone asks him about how do you fill the tuba with air, and he says, I don't fill the tuba with air, I fill the tuba with vibration. Of course, there's air already inside, we know that intuitively, but you vibrate that air through the motion of the motor function of the embouchure, and then the horn resonates. And if you work on the mouthpiece, if you have your horn tuned properly, the horn begins to vibrate in a different way. I know you've experienced this. It vibrates in a different way than if you had a slide in the wrong place, or you were trying to lip a note in a different place. You'd hit the note, but it wouldn't have the same resonance as it would if the slides were in the proper place and you're buzzing exactly the right. You get a more intense sound as a result of doing that. We were listening to some CSO recordings earlier, and honestly, at moments, the intensity of the sound is almost overwhelming because it is so powerful. Beautiful, but extremely powerful at the same time.
Yeah, really is amazing stuff. And just getting back to your pressure, he was by no means, he did not advocate a pressureless mouthpiece system. There was definitely some amount of pressure, just a balanced.
That's right. And I think, nothing that would restrict the vibration of the embouchure. And there are players, particularly maybe of the higher brass instruments, particularly that use pressure,
right,
as a way of getting notes. And I think he would say that you're kind of defeating your purpose in the course of doing that. But on tuba, there should never be any feeling of resistance or pressure in your playing, and on the mouthpiece as well. I think that would be something that he would dissuade people from doing in their playing.
Thank you. Frank, when you were with the Marine Band, I remember in 1991 you had Mr. Jacobs out to the Marine Band for, was it a full week?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Wow, how did that come about?
Well, I had this idea that it would be a wonderful professional development opportunity for the musicians in the Marine Band to have the opportunity to experience Mr. Jacobs, some of whom had studied with him here and there. But, it took a lot of effort to organize this, and there were health issues and other things that caused us to delay this, but finally it happened. And he came to Washington, and over a period of 5 days, he literally presented a series of lectures and master classes for each instrument in the band. From practically 9 in the morning until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, virtually every day. I don't remember the exact schedule, but they were full days. And he started off with a general lecture, and he finished with a general lecture, but in between, he sat there and worked with, everything from tuba players to clarinet, flute, double reeds, French horns, everything, and had the opportunity to, talk about the particular problems of each. And our mutual friend Brian Fredrickson has said it's really the only thing that he has on video where he is discussing every single wind instrument.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable that he would spend the whole week discussing in detail the various applications for all the instruments.
And the way he did it was sort of in a masterclass format where anyone who wanted to come and observe any other instrumental group could do that, but it wasn't like private lessons. He had several people were selected to play or, demonstrate things, and he would do this in front of everyone else, and everyone would benefit from watching and hearing what had happened. And the common things you would imagine that would came out, such as people not using their full vital capacity and people being more accustomed to air pressure than air movement.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And then, talking about the CD project, that was in the later, that was more or less, that was after he had passed away,
yes,
is when these came out. But when did you get the idea, and what prompted
Well, I had been talking with Sam Palafian about Mr. Jacobs passing, and he, had the idea. He said, you know, you are really good at doing projects. Why don't you take on, and you studied with him, so why don't you take on the project of putting something together that would help to keep his memory alive. And I loved the idea and didn't have a clue what I was getting myself into. But
Good thing.
Yeah, it was. And it took about a year and a half for the first one, and probably about a year for the second one of work. And it was a matter of collecting material, and I was very fortunate to be able to go see Mrs. Jacobs and Dallas, and they let me borrow some things from Jake's personal collection, which ultimately became part of the CDs. But it was really a treasure hunt, looking for needles in the haystack of a lot of material. And there was a very limited amount. There was not a lot out there, but trying to track down things like and looking for the best quality copies of things like the master tape of the fanfares that were recorded at Ravinia, not knowing that on that same tape were some orchestral excerpts played by each of the principal brass players from the CSO, and some of that made it onto the CDs, to the brass quintet concert from the Auditorium Theater, to other things, and many permissions had to be obtained, and every player in the CSO that was represented on this CD had to individually give their permission to allow this to happen. And
the record labels,
yes.
they had to get involved
Yes,
too.
they did. Yes, yes.
That's quite a.
Oh my gosh.
That's complicated, right there.
It was. But I was persistent, and managed to get it put together. And my goal was that the project, the CD itself, would tell its own story, and every word that was spoken on there would be spoken by Jake. And knowing a bit about his philosophies, I set out to try to capture the very key concepts on each of these CDs that everyone needed to hear, and to have each one of them be in its own way kind of a complete unit, so that if you heard Legacy, the second one before Portrait of an Artist, it was okay. But if you only heard one of them, you would have enough information to understand his concepts. And I think many people have enjoyed hearing them. We all lament that there was not more material available, but it has turned out to be something that I was very privileged and proud to do. And I honestly felt that it was some small way that I could repay him for all I felt he had done for me. And I know toward the end of his life, he was concerned that he might be better remembered as a teacher than as a performer. So I wanted people to know what a magnificent performer he was, and quite honestly, at the time I did the project, he'd been retired from the CSO over 10 years, I think, and most of the young people who were in high school and college never heard him play in the orchestra. And were not familiar with it, much less to know that he had such virtuoso capabilities, as a soloist. So I hope that all of this would, help to enhance his reputation as an artist and a teacher, and also help other people to have some sense of who this man was and what a profound contribution he made to brass playing and to so many brass players, past and present.
Well, I can tell you when I got the first copy of the first CD, I couldn't believe it. I mean, what an amazing job that was done. I didn't know you at the time. It was astounding to me that you were able to put all of that material on a disc, and just knowing a little bit about what I do about permissions and recording companies and what just a gargantuan task. And then also getting to hear Jake in the basement.
Right.
Because Charlie Shook and I, one of my contemporaries at Northwestern, we would sometimes comment to each other, I wonder what Jake sounds like in the basement. And so when those discs came out, there it was.
Well, earlier today, you and I sat and listened to some of the other material that was not included on these discs for a variety of reasons. Some of it doesn't have great sound quality, and for all kinds of reasons. But it's unvarnished,
Yeah.
and it's very random, because quite honestly, he would grab a tape and stick it on the machine, and it might be something that he'd used before, and he's reusing tapes all the time.
Right.
And there was nothing structured about this. It's almost like you're dropping into his basement at totally random periods in history, and on this particular day, this is what he's doing. But what is astounding about hearing it is the incredibly high standards that he exercised in his own practice. And what he talked about so many times of, quote, performing for a tape recorder,
Mm-hmm.
he's absolutely doing this.
Right.
And he's even speaking to the tape recorder as if there's an audience there.
It's true. Yeah.
And he's treating it like a performance, and then he's going back and analyzing his own playing after the fact. But, Arnold Jacobs was a flesh and blood human being. He did miss notes once in a while. But on balance, what he did was at such an incredibly high level. And I don't think any of us, really, anybody I can think of, would want their practicing tapes put forward to the world. The standard that he exhibited in his own practice was really very impressive, and the man absolutely practiced what he preached.
That's very true. Well, Puddles was so excited when I told him that we were going to be coming to meet you, because he's listened to both those discs, and he has selected for you a pair of matching reusable shopping bags, genuine University of Oregon Ducks shopping bags for your shopping pleasure.
Thank you.
We
so
hope
much,
you
Mike. And thank you, Puddles.
accept it with our pleasure and our good wishes.
Thank you, sir.
And thanks so much for a wonderful time here in Kansas City.
My pleasure.
And now, back to you. There you go.
Thank you.